Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fact Check Simplified. Today, we're talking about that time when a handful of tech companies unveiled a magical box that could create infinite art, and the entire world simultaneously forgot to ask what was inside the box. Think of it as the world's most consequential startup pitch, where the product demo was so dazzling that nobody bothered to check if the factory was built on a graveyard of intellectual property. This is the story of how generative AI crashed the creative world's party, drank all the punch, and then tried to convince everyone it had invented punch. We're going to untangle this glorious, infuriating mess. But be warned, our simplification process may involve a level of sarcasm typically reserved for reading corporate apology letters before the inevitable betrayal and multi-billion-dollar lawsuits begin. If you enjoy this highly dramatic but fun version of Modern Facts, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us pay the electric bill for our overpriced standing desks. All right, grab an iced latte. Things are about to get unnecessarily infuriating. It all started so innocently. Picture the internet circa 2022. The vibe was stagnant. We were doom scrolling through the 10th variation of the same meme, algorithmically trapped in our little digital bubbles, convinced that peak innovation was a phone that folded in half. Then, suddenly, a new toy appeared. Not just any toy, but a god-tier, paradigm-shifting, reality-bending contraption that felt like it was beamed down from a distant, much cooler future. This was the dawn of the public-facing text-to-image AI generator. Names like DALL-E 2, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion began bubbling up from the tech forums and landing squarely in the mainstream. And they came with a simple, irresistible promise. You type, it draws. The proposition was pure magic. You, a regular person with the artistic talent of a caffeinated squirrel, could now conjure breathtaking visuals with a simple string of words. A cyberpunk fox meditating in a neon-drenched forest. Bam, there it was. A photorealistic portrait of Socrates eating a hot dog. Done. The meaning of life, visualized as a chair. The AI would give it a shot, and honestly, the results were often more profound than anything a human philosopher had come up with in centuries. For a few glorious months, social media feeds were transformed from endless political screeds into a bizarre, collaborative art gallery. It was a digital Cambrian explosion of creativity. Everyone was an artist, a visionary, a director with an infinitely powerful special effects team at their fingertips. This wasn't some clunky, early 2000s software that spat out distorted nightmares. The outputs were stunning. They were coherent, beautiful, and sometimes deeply moving. Midjourney, in particular, became the king of epic, moody fantasy landscapes that looked like they'd been ripped from the cover of a prog rock album. Stable Diffusion, the open-source wild card, let people run the magic on their own computers, leading to an explosion of unfiltered, chaotic, and often hilarious experimentation. The collective reaction wasn't just excitement, it was awe. It felt like we'd finally reached a technological singularity, the kind science fiction had been promising for decades. We had democratized art creation. We had handed a paintbrush to every single person with a keyboard, and in this euphoric gold rush of infinite images, absolutely nobody, or at least nobody loud enough to puncture the hype bubble, stopped to ask the one question that mattered. How? How does it know what a fox looks like? How does it understand the subtle nuances of a cyberpunk aesthetic or the specific lighting of a neon-drenched forest? The machine was a black box, a mysterious oracle. You fed it a prayer in the form of a prompt, and it delivered a miracle. Questioning the process felt like asking a magician to reveal his secrets. It would ruin the fun, and the fun was spectacular. The technology was so far beyond what most people thought was possible that it felt like it had simply sprung into existence, fully formed, a gift from the tech gods. Let's map this out with a quick cause and effect chain, because the speed of this whole thing is crucial. Cause, a profoundly powerful and intuitive creative tool, is released to the public, mostly for free. It requires no skill, only imagination. Effect, the tool goes viral on a planetary scale. Millions of people who have never drawn anything more complex than a smiley face are suddenly generating intricate, professional-looking artwork and flooding the internet with it. Consequence, the technology becomes deeply embedded in digital culture and workflows before anyone can have a meaningful conversation about its ethical, legal, or economic implications. The precedent was set. This tool exists, it is powerful, and it is ours to use. The terms and conditions would, as always, be read later, preferably never. Our meta commentary here is just a deep, exasperated sigh. This is Silicon Valley's favorite playbook, the disrupt first, apologize later gambit. They don't sell you a product. They launch a social experiment at scale and see what happens. We did it with social media, cheerfully handing over our personal data in exchange for cat videos, only to realize a decade later we'd accidentally destabilized democracy. We did it with ride-sharing, celebrating cheap taxis until we noticed local transit systems were gutted, and drivers were making less than minimum wage. And now we were doing it with art. The assumption, baked into the very fabric of tech utopianism, is that progress is inevitable, and any collateral damage is simply the price of admission to a brighter future. The initial vibe was so positive, so collaborative. Online communities sprang up overnight, dedicated to the new craft of prompt engineering. It was a new language, a new skill. People shared their most effective prompts like secret recipes. Add Unreal Engine 5 for realism. Use Greg Rutkowski for epic fantasy vibes. It was a global festival of experimentation. Tech enthusiasts and digital artists were, for a moment, on the same team, marveling at the strange and wonderful pictures the Ghost in the Machine was making for them. The honeymoon period was in full swing, a beautiful, naive summer of love between humanity and its new creative muse, but the central, unspoken truth lingered just beneath the surface. This AI wasn't born with an innate understanding of art history. It didn't have a soul or a tortured past to draw upon for inspiration. It learned. It learned the same way a human student learns, by studying vast amounts of existing work. And as the initial shock and awe began to fade, a different group of people started looking closer. These were the human artists, the photographers, the illustrators, the people who had spent their entire lives honing their craft. They weren't just looking at the pretty pictures, they were looking at the brush strokes. And they started to notice something unsettling, something eerily familiar. The magic show was about to end, and the stage hands were about to present the bill. So, the artists started squinting, while the rest of the world was gleefully commanding their new AI butler to paint Darth Vader on a flamingo floaty in the style of Van Gogh, the actual living, breathing artists, the ones who pay rent by making things, were experiencing a chilling sense of déjà vu. They'd scroll through an endless gallery of AI-generated marvels and stop dead. That highlight on the armor, the specific way the clouds are rendered, the subtle color palette that took them a decade to perfect, it felt familiar. Familiar. It was like hearing a cover band play your favorite song note for note, but with a soulless, robotic singer. At first, it was just a strange echo. But the echo grew louder, more insistent, until it became a deafening roar. The breakthrough, or rather, the breakdown, came when users discovered the ultimate cheat code. The magic word. The skeleton key to unlocking any aesthetic you could possibly desire. Just add an artist's name. You didn't have to painstakingly describe a style. You didn't need to understand art theory. You just had to type in the style of artist name here. And the AI, the ever-obedient servant, would comply flawlessly. Suddenly, the internet wasn't just filled with generic fantasy art. It was filled with art in the style of Greg Rutkowski. It wasn't just cool sci-fi concepts. It was concepts rendered in the style of Sparth. It wasn't quirky comics. It was comics in the style of Sarah Anderson. Let's use Greg Rutkowski as the tragic poster child for this phenomenon. Rutkowski is a Polish fantasy artist, incredibly talented and successful, known for his epic, painterly style. He is the kind of artist you hire for big-ticket projects like Magic, The Gathering, and Dungeons and Dragons. He has a signature, a brand, a visual fingerprint that is instantly recognizable. And overnight, he became one of the most popular keywords in the AI art world. A snapshot from the data showed his name was used as a prompt in Stable Diffusion and Midjourney millions of times. That's more than Picasso, more than Rembrandt, more than Da Vinci. A living artist, at the peak of his career, had his entire creative identity scraped, analyzed, and turned into a cheap filter for the masses. Imagine the sheer psychological horror of that. You wake up one day to find that a machine has learned to perfectly replicate your life's work. The internet is now drowning in forgeries that bear your creative DNA, but were generated in seconds by anonymous users. Your name, once a symbol of your skill and hard work, has been transformed into a button on a vending machine. Press Rutkowski, get epic fantasy. Press Anderson, get relatable comics. Your soul, your struggle, your years of practice, all reduced to a command line argument. It wasn't just his style. It was his name, his reputation, his entire market viability being strip-mined for parts. This is where the artists all curdled into raw fury. Here's the brutal chain of events, cause, users, and a completely rational quest for better outputs. Realize that naming specific artists is the fastest way to get a high-quality, stylistically coherent image from the AI. Effect, the AI models, which had been fed a diet of these artists' portfolios without their consent, spit out eerily accurate pastiches. The replication is so good that it becomes impossible for a casual observer to distinguish a real work from an AI-generated one in the same style. Consequence: an artist's unique signature. The most valuable asset they possess is instantly devalued and commodified. It becomes a publicly accessible feature, not a personal, earned skill. They are now forced to compete in a marketplace against an infinite number of works that look just like theirs but are free and instantaneous. The meta commentary here is that this was perhaps the most predictable outcome imaginable. Yet the tech companies seemed genuinely shocked when artists weren't flattered. They peddled the line that this was an homage, a tribute. But it's not an homage when you automate the person's entire being. It's an erasure. It's like building a robot that can perfectly replicate your mother's cooking, then marketing it as GrandmaBot 5000 and wondering why your mom isn't thrilled. You didn't just copy her recipe, you tried to make her obsolete. This wasn't inspiration. It was parasitic replication. Artists like Carla Ortiz, an award-winning concept artist, became vocal critics. She and others began collecting evidence, showing side-by-side comparisons of their work and the AI outputs. The similarities were undeniable. It wasn't just a vibe, it was specific compositional choices, color relationships, and textural details. The AI hadn't just learned from their art, it had ingested it, broken it down into a statistical smoothie, and could now regurgitate it on command. The feeling of violation was profound. It was the digital equivalent of finding out someone had broken into your studio, scanned every single sketchbook and canvas, and was now selling prints of new paintings based on your private, unfinished ideas. The horror snowballed. It wasn't just about losing commissions, though that was a very real and immediate fear. It was about losing control of your own creative identity, about seeing your name attached to images you found ugly, or offensive, or just plain mediocre. It was about the slow, creeping dread that your entire career, your entire field of human endeavor, was being systematically dismantled and fed into a machine that would then be sold back to you as a service. The promise of democratizing art now sounded less like a utopian dream and more like a hostile corporate takeover of the human imagination. The fun was over. The game was up. They looked past the pretty pictures, past the slick user interfaces, and stared directly at the black box. And they asked, with a voice that was quickly losing its patience, "Okay, you taught your machine to paint like me. Where, exactly, did you get my paintings?" The time for magic and mystery was over. It was time to see the receipts. So the artists, now sharpening their digital pitchforks, demanded the receipts. They pointed at the magic box and asked the question that should have been on a billboard in Times Square from day one: what did you feed this thing? The answer, when it finally came, was delivered with the calm, unblinking confidence of a Silicon Valley CEO explaining why a privacy violation is actually a feature. It was an answer of such breathtaking audacity that it almost looped back around to being impressive. Where did the training data come from? They told us they had scraped the public web. Let that phrase sink in. The public web. It sounds so clean, so harmless, so public, like they went to a town square and took some notes. But what it actually means is this: they built automated programs, little digital locusts called scrapers, and unleashed them upon the internet with a single, voracious command: take everything. These bots crawled from webpage to webpage, downloading every image, every piece of text, every blog post, every comment. They didn't distinguish between a Rembrandt painting in the public domain and a living artist's private portfolio. They didn't care about a do not enter sign in a website's code. They ignored the phrase "all rights reserved" with the same indifference a bulldozer shows to a flower bed. They read the entire internet. This wasn't some curated, ethically sourced library of licensed content. Oh no, that would have been expensive and slow. This was a smash and grab operation on a planetary scale. Your ArtStation portfolio in the dataset, your personal photography blog from 2008 in the dataset, billions of images from Pinterest, Flickr, DeviantArt, and countless other sites. You bet they're in the dataset. News articles, medical journals, fan fiction archives, celebrity photos, stock image sites complete with their pathetic, now ironic watermarks that all went into the digital blender. The companies behind this technological marvel, OpenAI, Stability AI, Midjourney, all offered variations of the same serenely unapologetic explanation. They used publicly available data to train their models. Let us break down the horrifying logic with another one of our patented cause and effect chains. Cause: to teach an AI to understand the near infinite complexity of human visual language, you need a dataset of literally billions of images and text captions. Acquiring this legally through licenses would cost a fortune and take decades. Effect: the tech companies decided to bypass this inconvenience by redefining the word public. They adopted the radical position that if something is visible on the internet without a password, it is publicly available and therefore fair game to be copied, analyzed, and used as raw material for a commercial product. Consequence: the entire legal and ethical framework of copyright, which is built on the principle that creators have the right to control their work, was rendered null and void. By a simple engineering decision, consent was never sought because, in this new paradigm, it was deemed irrelevant. The meta commentary here is that we need to invent a new word for this level of cosmic, galaxy-brained arrogance. The argument that publicly visible equals free for the taking is sociopathic. Your car is publicly visible when it's parked on the street. That doesn't give me the right to hotwire it and enter it into a demolition derby. The Mona Lisa is publicly visible at the Louvre. That doesn't mean you can scrape off the paint, mix it with some glitter, and sell it as your own original masterpiece. Yet, this was the foundational premise of the entire generative AI revolution. It was an industry built on a philosophical loophole, a deliberate and self-serving misinterpretation of what it means to share something with the world. This reveal was the point of no return. The conflict was no longer a philosophical debate about the nature of art or inspiration. It was a cold, hard dispute over property and labor. The magic trick was explained, and it turned out the magician was simply picking the audience's pockets and then dazzling them with their own wallets. The artist's work wasn't the inspiration for the AI, it was the literal, unprocessed, uncredited raw material. They were the unpaid, unwilling ghostwriters for a machine that was being marketed as their replacement. Their creativity was the fuel, their labor was the engine, and their consent was the pesky detail that got left on the factory floor. The sheer scale is difficult to comprehend. We're not talking about a student making a collage for a school project. We're talking about corporations, now valued in the billions, systematically ingesting the sum total of human visual culture without permission, and they did it, all under the guise of progress, of innovation, of the inevitable march of technology. They presented it as a force of nature, like a hurricane or an earthquake. Something you can't argue with, something you just have to adapt to, but it wasn't a hurricane. It was a series of deliberate choices made by a small group of people who stood to make an obscene amount of money. So when the artists heard the excuse, "We used the public web," they didn't hear a technical explanation. They heard a confession. They heard an admission that their life's work, their intellectual property, their very creative essence, had been consumed without a second thought. The betrayal was absolute. The fight was on. The vague, corporate speak answer of the internet was no longer enough. The next question was obvious. Show us the list. Give us the name of the dataset. Let's see exactly how big this digital heist really was. So, the confession was on the table. We read the whole internet. But that's a bit like saying you drank the whole ocean. It's a statement so vast it's meaningless. To understand the sheer, terrifying scale of this operation, you have to visualize the process. This wasn't a guy in a hoodie manually right-clicking and saving images. This was a silent, invisible, industrial-scale harvesting of human culture, conducted by armies of automated bots. And it happened while we were all busy arguing about pineapple on pizza. Imagine a fleet of tireless, infinitely fast librarian bots. Their mission isn't to read or understand books, but to photocopy every single page of every single book in every library on Earth. They don't ask for a library card. They don't obey the quiet please signs. They ignore the checkout counter and the horrified librarians chasing after them. They simply enter, duplicate, and move on. They don't distinguish between a sacred text and a grocery list left in a copy of Twilight. To the bots, it's all just paper. It's all just data. Now, replace the library with the internet and the books with every website, every image, every word ever posted. That's web scraping. This process is brutally, algorithmically indifferent. It doesn't see a heartfelt memorial blog for a lost pet. It sees a block of text and a JPEG. It doesn't see a photographer's carefully curated portfolio, the culmination of a life's work. It sees a directory of high-resolution pixel data. This automated vacuum cleaner sucked up our digital lives, our creative output, our shared cultural memory, and dumped it all into colossal data centers, ready to be processed. The great irony is that this was happening in plain sight. The tools and the data were, in a way, public. The heist was announced in academic papers and blog posts, but it was written in a language so dry and technical that normal humans would rather watch paint dry. A key player in this story is an organization called Common Crawl. On the surface, it sounds like one of the good guys. It's a non-profit foundation whose mission is to build and maintain a massive, publicly accessible archive of the web. Think of it as a charity that provides the photocopied pages of that global library to anyone who asks, primarily for research, analysis, and education. A noble goal, right? A resource for the public good. And for years, that's mostly what it was used for. Academics and data scientists would sift through it to study the structure of the internet, or track the evolution of language. Then the generative AI boom hit, and these well-meaning public archives were turned into the world's biggest, most convenient, ethically laundered feeding troughs. Here is the chain of plausible deniability, cause. Scraping petabytes of data from billions of websites is technically complex, legally dicey, and draws unwanted attention. Effect, a non-profit like Common Crawl does the dirty work under the noble banner of archiving the web for research. It then makes this colossal dataset a snapshot of the entire internet freely available. Consequence, for-profit AI labs can now simply download this pre-scraped, pre-packaged data and claim they are using a public resource. This masterfully distances them from the ethically radioactive act of the initial scrape. They didn't steal the data. They just took it from the nice charity that did. This is the meta commentary moment where you just have to applaud the sheer genius of the maneuver. It's a masterclass in ethical outsourcing. It is like commissioning a heist and then claiming you're innocent because you only downloaded the bank blueprints from the public library. Snapshot, a single Common Crawl dataset can contain over 40 petabytes of data. That's 40 million gigabytes. It's an amount of information so large it's functionally incomprehensible to a human brain. And it was the foundational ingredient for AI models that would go on to be valued in the billions. This was the silent, invisible infrastructure of the great digital heist. It was built over years, humming away in server farms, executed with an efficiency that would make a Bond villain jealous. And we, the users of the internet, the creators of all this content, were the unpaid, unwitting suppliers. Every time we uploaded a photo, wrote a blog post, or posted a piece of art, we were tossing another drop of fuel into the engine of a machine we didn't even know was being built. Our digital existence was being strip-mined, and we were too busy scrolling to notice the excavation equipment. For the artists, this realization was a particular kind of horror. They weren't even special enough to be targeted. They were just data, their portfolios, their studios. Their creative souls were just another folder in a multi-petabyte zip file. Their work was harvested with the same automated indifference as a billion cat memes, corporate press releases, and expired eBay listings. The machine didn't steal their art because it valued it as art. It stole their art because it was a statistically significant cluster of well-labeled pixels. The insult was somehow deeper than the injury, and so, with the how of the heist now chillingly clear, the conversation had to turn to the why, or more accurately, the supposed justification. What legal theory, what philosophical argument could possibly make this okay? So, the crime scene was established. The method was clear, industrial-scale data scraping. The evidence was the AI's uncanny ability to mimic artists. Now, all that was left was for the suspects, the AI labs, to deliver their alibi, faced with a tidal wave of accusations about mass copyright infringement, a legal concept that can carry damages in the trillions. They didn't panic. They didn't deny taking the data. Instead, they responded with a move of such breathtaking rhetorical gymnastics that it left the legal world momentarily stunned. They essentially looked at the entire edifice of copyright law, a system of rules built over centuries, and hit it with the legal equivalent of a shrug emoji. Their defense was simple, elegant, and profoundly infuriating. They claimed copyright law didn't even apply. Why? Because their machines weren't copying the work. They were learning from it. This was the masterstroke, a single word change designed to reframe the entire debate. Copying is illegal, mechanical, and soulless. It implies theft, but learning well. That's beautiful. That's noble. It's what humans do. It evokes images of a diligent student in a grand library, absorbing the wisdom of the ages to create something new and wonderful. Who could possibly be against learning? Suing someone for learning would be like suing a child for reading a book. It was a brilliant, calculated appeal to emotion, designed to make the artists look like Luddites trying to padlock the Library of Progress. Here's how they explained it. Armed with a barrage of technical jargon that made journalists' eyes glaze over, they argued that the AI model, the neural network, doesn't actually store any of the images it's trained on. There's no secret hard drive inside the AI filled with stolen JPEGs. Instead, the training process is about pattern recognition. The AI analyzes billions of images and uses them to adjust billions of internal numbers. Called weights or parameters, the final result is a model that is, in essence, just a massive, complex mathematical formula. It doesn't contain your art, it contains a statistical understanding of your art's texture, composition, and color palette. The defense was, essentially, there is no crime here. There are no copies. It's just math, bro. This led to the most pivotal strategic maneuver in the entire conflict. Let us break it down, cause the AI industry faces an existential legal threat from copyright holders who claim that training on their data is mass infringement. In fact, the companies build their defense around the semantic distinction between copying and learning. They create an analogy comparing their AI to a human student, a relatable and sympathetic image that obscures the mechanical, industrial nature of the process. Consequence: the legal battle is instantly dragged from the clear-cut territory of property rights into a murky, philosophical swamp. The conversation becomes, what is learning? What is a copy? What is art? This confusion is the entire point. It's a defensive smokescreen designed to paralyze the slow-moving legal system. And now, for the meta commentary, the AI is like a human student analogy is. And I say this with all the intellectual rigor I can muster, a load of manipulative garbage. A human student has experiences, emotions, a terrible short-term memory, and a limited capacity for intake. A human synthesizes, interprets, and is shaped by 1,000 other inputs beyond the art they study. Crucially, a human forgets. The AI does not. It is a hyper-efficient statistical engine that creates a mathematical map of its training data, so precise it can reproduce it on command. Calling both processes learning is a deliberate act of anthropomorphic misdirection. It is like looking at a high-speed industrial meat grinder and a chef carefully dicing an onion, and calling both food preparation. The comparison is technically true but morally and functionally bankrupt. This defense was the industry's first wall, a fortress built of semantics and complexity. They argued that because the output is not a one-to-one copy of any single input, it is a new, original work. The AI, they claimed, was not a plagiarist, it was a muse, a tool for inspiration, a collaborator. But this ignores the fundamental violation. The model's ability to create anything at all is entirely dependent on the initial, unconsented ingestion of copyrighted material. It is, by definition, a derivative work of everything it was trained on. The fruit of a poison tree might look delicious and new, but it's still fundamentally a product of that poison tree. For a moment, this argument seemed to work. It was confusing enough, technical enough, and forward-looking enough to make a lot of people pause. Maybe this was different. Maybe the old laws really didn't apply. The tech companies were betting they could win in the court of public opinion by positioning themselves as the champions of innovation and the artists as gatekeepers of the past. They essentially told the entire creative economy, your business model is obsolete, your laws are irrelevant, and your complaints are just the unfortunate but necessary growing pains of a technological revolution. Resistance is futile. Please enjoy the future we have built on the back of your uncompensated labor. But the artists and their increasingly agitated lawyers weren't buying it. The "it's just math" defense was cute, but it was about to collide with a very specific, very tangible exhibit, a dataset so infamous it would become a household name in the AI ethics world. The tech industry's elegant "it's just math" defense was a beautiful theory. It was clean, abstract, and floated comfortably in the realm of philosophy, but it had one tiny, catastrophic vulnerability. It could be fact-checked. The artists and their lawyers were tired of debating the metaphysical nature of learning. They wanted to see the textbook the machine had studied from. And thanks to the open source community's commitment to transparency, they got their wish. The textbook had a name, Lion 5B. And reading it was like opening a Pandora's box full of copyright infringement, privacy violations, and existential dread. Lion, which stands for Large-Scale Artificial Intelligence Open Network, is a German nonprofit. Their goal, much like Common Crawls, was to advance AI research by providing a massive, publicly available dataset. Their magnum opus was Lion 5B, a monstrously large collection. It's not a collection of images itself, but rather a list of URLs pointing to 5.85 billion image text pairs that their bots had found on the internet. This dataset was the primary fuel used to train Stable Diffusion, one of the most powerful and popular AI image generators, and because it was open source, anybody could download the list and see exactly what was in it. The black box was cracked wide open. What journalists, researchers, and horrified artists found inside wasn't just a library of art. It was a digital snapshot of humanity's entire, unedited, uncurated, and often unhinged attic. The "we scrape the public web" excuse was no longer an abstraction, it was a searchable database of sins. First, there was the copyrighted material. Not just a few images here and there, but vast, commercial-scale collections. Researchers found hundreds of thousands of images scraped directly from stock photo sites, like Getty Images and Shutterstock, complete with their defiant, and now deeply ironic, watermarks. The AI hadn't just learned from art. It had learned from the very inventory of companies whose entire business is based on selling licenses to use that art. Then it got worse. So much worse. The scrapers had vacuumed up personal photo albums from sites like Flickr, private family moments, birthday parties, vacation photos, all ingested and turned into training data. It got more intimate. They found personal blogs, including patient forums where people had uploaded deeply sensitive medical photos to ask for advice. Graphic images of skin conditions, surgical scars, and medical procedures were all in there, scraped and cataloged with their descriptive text, ready to teach an AI what human suffering looked like. The concept of consent had been so thoroughly ignored it felt like a deliberate insult. Let's run the catastrophic cause and effect, CAUSE, the open source AI movement, aiming to compete with giants like OpenAI, needed a colossal, free, and open dataset to power its models. Effect, the nonprofit Lion is formed to meet this need, creating the Lion 5B dataset by filtering the already scraped data from Common Crawl, essentially packaging the heist for easy consumption. Consequence, for the first time, the public gets a clear view into the sausage factory of AI training. The horrifying, indiscriminate nature of the data collection is exposed, providing concrete, searchable proof of copyright infringement and privacy violations on a scale never before imagined. The meta-commentary writes itself. The creators of the dataset included a filter designed to remove not safe for work content, but it was like trying to filter the ocean with a tea strainer. The dataset was absolutely teeming with pornography, hateful memes, and violent imagery scraped from the darkest pits of the internet. This wasn't a carefully curated curriculum for a new intelligence. It was a chaotic, toxic digital dumpster fire. The quest for scale, the need for billions of data points had completely overridden any semblance of ethical curation. The philosophy was simple: more data is always better, and the consequences are someone else's problem. This bombshell completely shattered the tech industry's carefully constructed narrative. The serene image of a student AI learning from the great works of humanity was replaced with the grotesque reality of a machine being force-fed a slurry of stolen art, medical records, and hate speech. It was no longer a philosophical debate, it was a matter of public record. You could literally visit a website, type in your name or your company's name, and see if your intellectual property or your private photos were part of the machine's diet. For the artists, this was the smoking gun. Their feeling of being violated was now a verifiable, documented event. They could point to a specific line in a specific database and say, "That's mine. I never gave you permission to use that." And now, your multi-billion-dollar enterprise is built on it. The Lion 5B dataset became Exhibit A in the case against generative AI. It transformed the abstract anger into a focused, evidence-based rage. The vague enemy now had a face, or at least, a file name. And with concrete proof in hand, the artists were no longer just victims. They were about to become insurgents. The discovery of the Lion 5B dataset was a declaration of war, and in war, you don't just protest. You fight back. The artists, having seen the sheer, indiscriminate scale of the data heist, came to a grim realization: begging for mercy from the machine was not a viable strategy. The scraping was automated, relentless, and happening on a scale that dwarfed any individual's ability to opt out or send a cease and desist letter. Waiting for copyright law to grind its way through the courts could take years, by which time their careers might be rendered obsolete. So they adopted the mantra of any good insurgency: if you can't beat them, break their toys. This was the moment the artists became saboteurs. They realized they had to fight algorithms with algorithms. If their work was being ingested by a machine, then they needed a way to make their art indigestible. They needed to invent digital poison. This effort was spearheaded not by rogue hackers in a basement, but by a team of academics at the University of Chicago, who saw the existential threat AI posed to creators and decided to arm the resistance. They developed a suite of tools that were, in essence, digital booby traps for AI models. The first, and most famous, was a defensive shield called Glaze. Glaze is a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare. An artist can run their finished artwork through the Glaze software. Before uploading it, the tool makes tiny, almost imperceptible changes to the pixels of the image, what the researchers call perturbations. To the human eye, the artwork looks virtually identical, but to an AI model trying to analyze the image's style, these subtle changes act as a powerful jamming signal. The AI looks at a glazed painting in the style of Van Gogh and gets confused, seeing instead the style of, say, Jackson Pollock. It effectively cloaks an artist's signature style, making it impossible for the AI to learn from and mimic it. It was a digital invisibility cloak designed to protect an artist's most valuable asset, their uniqueness. But defense is one thing. The resistance wanted to go on the offensive, and so the Chicago team developed Glaze's evil twin, Nightshade. Nightshade is not a shield, it is a poison pill. It's a tool of active sabotage. Like Glaze, it alters an image in ways that are subtle to the human eye, but its purpose is far more malicious. A Nightshade poisoned image of a dog, when scraped and ingested by an AI model, will teach the model that the text prompt dog actually corresponds to the image of a hat. Now, one poisoned image won't do much. But what if thousands of artists started using Nightshade? What if tens of thousands of poisoned images of dogs all taught the AI that dogs are hats? The result would be model corruption. The AI's internal understanding of the world would start to break down. Users would type in a golden retriever fetching a ball, and the model, its mind poisoned by Nightshade, would spit out an image of a golden fedora lying on the grass. By poisoning prompts for common objects, cars, trees, hands, buildings, artists could collectively degrade the performance and reliability of the very models that were being trained on their work. It was a way to fight back not just for themselves, but for the entire creative community. Let's follow the chain of escalation. Cause artists, feeling completely ignored and exploited by tech companies, realize that legal and social pressure are too slow to stop the automated scraping of their work. Effect, sympathetic researchers and developers create publicly available tools like Glaze and Nightshade, empowering individual artists to take direct, technical action to protect their style and sabotage the training process. Consequence, a new front opens in the AI conflict, a direct, technical arms race. It becomes a cat and mouse game between data poisoners and AI labs trying to develop defenses to detect and filter out the poisoned data. The meta commentary here is just, wow, we have reached the point in our supposed techno-utopia where artists have to spend their precious time running their art through counter-surveillance software and planting digital IEDs in their own portfolios. This is a sign of a social contract that has been utterly shattered. It's a decentralized, grassroots guerrilla war. The artists are the Viet Cong, and the AI labs are the lumbering, overconfident superpower. They can't win in a head-on battle, so they resort to clever traps and sabotage. It's an inspiring act of defiance born from sheer desperation, a testament to the human will to resist being rendered into a statistical footnote. The adoption was immediate and enthusiastic. Artists who had felt powerless for months were suddenly empowered. Glaze work became a rallying cry on social media. The act of poisoning data became a form of protest, a way to collectively throw sand in the gears of the great machine. It was a recognition that if the digital commons were going to be strip-mined without permission, then the miners should have to worry about the ore being radioactive. This was no longer just about protecting one's own work. It was about making the entire practice of indiscriminate scraping so costly and unreliable that it would force the AI labs to change their methods. But even as this digital insurgency was taking root, a far more traditional form of warfare was being prepared. The disorganized online outrage was about to get organized, funded, and lawyered up. The quiet hum of the servers was about to be drowned out by the sound of gavels, while the digital partisans were busy booby-trapping their portfolios with Glaze and Nightshade. A different kind of army was mobilizing. This one wore suits, carried briefcases, and charged by the hour. The scattered, furious tweets and blog posts of thousands of artists had finally coalesced into a single, deafening legal roar. The online debate was over. The court case was about to begin. Enter the lawyers. In January 2023, the conflict officially escalated from a messy cultural war into a high-stakes legal battle that could define the future of creativity. A landmark class action lawsuit was filed in a California federal court, and it took direct aim at the giants of the generative AI world. The plaintiffs were three artists who became the public faces of the resistance: Sarah Anderson, the creator of the wildly popular webcomic Sarah Scribbles; Kelly McKernan, a renowned watercolor and acrylic painter; and Carla Ortiz, an acclaimed concept artist who had been one of the most vocal critics from the very beginning. They weren't just suing on behalf of themselves. They were suing on behalf of a class of potentially millions of artists whose work had been ingested without consent. And who were they suing? The big ones, The primary targets were Stability AI, the company behind Stable Diffusion, and Midjourney, the creator of the eponymous, hyper-artistic image generator. But the lawsuit also named a third defendant. And this one felt like a knife in the back to the creative community, DeviantArt, the very platform that had for decades served as an online haven for digital artists, had launched its own AI image generator, DreamUp. The betrayal was palpable. DeviantArt, the supposed sanctuary, was now seen as just another corporation strip, mining its own users for data to power a tool that would compete with them. The lawsuit laid out a series of explosive allegations that translated the artist's raw fury into cold, hard legal claims. Simplified for those of us who didn't go to law school, their arguments were direct copyright infringement. This was the main event. The suit alleged that by scraping billions of copyrighted images from the internet and using them to train their commercial AI models, the defendants had committed the largest-scale copyright violation in history. Full stop. You took it. You didn't pay for it. You didn't ask. Vicarious copyright infringement. This claim argued that even if the companies weren't creating the final infringing images themselves, they were encouraging and profiting from the infringement committed by their users. By providing a tool that could instantly create works in a specific artist's style, they were essentially handing out millions of skeleton keys to other people's studios. Violation of the DMCA. This was a clever one. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act makes it illegal to remove copyright management information, things like watermarks, artist names, and other metadata. The lawsuit argued that the AI training process inherently strips this information away, effectively laundering the stolen art of its identifying marks. Unlawful competition. Finally, the suit claimed that the defendants had built products that competed directly and unfairly with the very artists whose work they had used as a foundation. It's like stealing a chef's secret recipe book and then opening a discount restaurant next door that serves all their signature dishes. The chain reaction was swift and decisive, cause the overwhelming and publicly searchable evidence of mass scraping, combined with the artist's sustained and organized outrage, finally attracted the attention of powerhouse law firms specializing in class action suits. Effect: the grievances of a massive, decentralized group of creators were consolidated into a single, powerful legal weapon aimed directly at the heart of the generative AI industry. Consequence: the entire game changed. The AI companies were dragged out of the comfortable echo chamber of tech blogs and venture capital meetings and forced to defend their existence in a federal courtroom. The stakes were no longer about PR, but about potential bankruptcy. The meta commentary here is that this was the moment the move fast and break things philosophy finally broke on the shores of the United States legal code. The era of asking for forgiveness instead of permission was over. Now, forgiveness would be determined by a jury, and it could cost billions of dollars. For months, the AI labs had been able to control the narrative, framing their work as inevitable progress. The lawsuit was a formal, legally binding rejection of that narrative. It was the creative world standing up in unison and saying, no, what you did was not innovation. It was theft. And we have the receipts. This lawsuit sent a seismic shockwave through Silicon Valley. Investors who had poured billions into these companies suddenly had to add a massive asterisk to their profit projections, labeled potential catastrophic legal liability. The very foundation of the generative AI gold rush to free and easy access to training data was now officially contested. The future of the entire industry might hinge on the decision of a single judge in San Francisco. The fight for creative ownership had found its main event, its title match, and the AI companies, backed into a legal corner, knew they had to come out swinging with a defense. They needed a legal shield big enough to protect them from a billion-dollar lawsuit, and they reached for the most powerful and dangerously ambiguous weapon in the copyright arsenal. Backed into a corner by a massive class action lawsuit, the AI industry needed more than a clever slogan. Their initial, flimsy defense of "we're not copying, we're learning" was a fine little soundbite for a tech conference, but it would get laughed out of a federal courtroom. They had, undeniably, made copies of billions of protected works. The evidence was right there in the Lion 5B dataset, so, unable to deny the act, they had to justify it. They needed a legal shield, and they reached for the single most powerful, most debated, and most notoriously slippery concept in all of American copyright law: fair use. In theory, fair use is a reasonable and necessary part of copyright. It is the legal doctrine that says you can use a small piece of someone else's copyrighted work without permission for specific purposes, like commentary, criticism, news reporting, or education. It's why a movie reviewer can show a clip from the film they're reviewing. It's why a parody Artists can mimic a song to make fun of it. Fair use is the safety valve that prevents copyright from becoming an absolute, creativity-stifling monopoly. It is, in essence, the law's way of saying, don't be a jerk. But the AI industry's interpretation of fair use wasn't just a use of the doctrine. It was an attempt to stretch it into an all-encompassing get-out-of-jail-free card for industrial-scale data harvesting. Their entire argument rested on one magical, high-concept word, transformative. They claimed that feeding billions of images into a machine to create a new AI model was a transformative use of that data. They weren't just republishing the art. They were using it for a fundamentally new purpose to build a system capable of generating entirely novel outputs. The final model, they argued, was not a collection of copies but a new creation, and therefore, the initial copying was fair. To decide if something is fair use, courts typically weigh four factors. Let's look at them from the artist's perspective, shall we? The purpose and character of the use. Is it commercial? Yes, massively. Is it transformative? The AI labs scream yes, while the artists scream IT's theft. This is the central battleground. The nature of the copyrighted work. Was the original work creative or factual? The models were trained on art, photography, and writing, the most creative works imaginable, which are supposed to receive the strongest copyright protection. This factor does not look good. For the AI team, the amount of the work used. How much did they take? Did they quote a sentence, a paragraph? No. They took the entire damn thing. They ingested 100% of every image. This factor is a catastrophic failure for the fair use argument. The effect on the potential market. Does the new work harm the market for the original? The AI image generators are direct competitors to the artists and stock photo companies, whose work they were trained on. This is arguably the biggest, most obvious harm. So, on a quick tally, the AI companies seem to lose on at least 3 of the 4 factors, catastrophically so on 2 of them. But here's the legal chess move, cause, having no credible way to deny that they made verbatim copies of billions of protected works. The AI company's only viable legal defense is to admit to the copying but argue it was legally excused. In fact, they seize upon the transformative prong of the fair use test, arguing that the purpose of their copying was so novel and important, building a new form of intelligence, that it should outweigh all the other factors combined. Consequence, the entire legal war becomes a high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar philosophical debate over the meaning of the word transformative. The question is no longer did you take it, but did you take it for a cool enough reason? The meta-commentary here is that this is an act of spectacular legal audacity. The AI companies are essentially arguing that if your infringement is big enough, ambitious enough, and technologically impressive enough, it should transcend the law. It is like arguing that robbing every bank in the country is fair use of their money because you're going to use it to build a utopian city on Mars. The sheer scale of the copying, which should be a point against them, is being spun as evidence of its transformative nature. They are hiding behind the complexity of their own creation, hoping the courts will be too dazzled by the technology to focus on the fundamental trespass. This defense was their Hail Mary pass, their silver bullet, their one big bet. The entire industry, with its billions in venture capital funding and its world-changing ambitions, was now hiding behind a flexible, four-factor legal test originally designed to let book reviewers quote passages without getting sued. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. If it worked, they would have a legally protected right to train their models on any data they could find on the public web. If it failed, their entire business model would be declared illegal. But as the indie artists and their lawyers prepared for a long, drawn-out war over the definition of transformative, the battlefield was about to get a lot more crowded. Another player was watching from the sidelines, a corporate titan with a 100-year history, a famously aggressive legal team, and a vast, watermarked library of images that had shown up all over the Lion dataset. They were not amused. The fight was about to go from a David versus Goliath story to a Goliath versus Goliath story. The legal battle over fair use was set to be a long, grinding war of attrition between a scrappy artist coalition and the venture capital-fueled AI industry. It was a classic David versus Goliath narrative. But just as the first stones were being slung, a second Goliath lumbered onto the battlefield, took one look at the scene, and decided it wanted to join the fight. This wasn't another artist or a small creative studio. This was Getty Images, the undisputed global emperor of stock photography, and they were monumentally ticked off. In early 2023, just as the artist class action suit was getting underway, Getty Images dropped a legal bomb of its own, filing a massive lawsuit against Stability AI in the High Court of Justice. in London, and shortly after, another one in the United States. This changed the entire dynamic of the conflict. This wasn't about philosophical arguments over the future of art anymore. This was about cold, hard, corporate cash. Getty's business model is brutally simple. They own or license an unfathomable number of high-quality images, and they charge people money to use them. Stability AI, they alleged, had simply waltzed into their digital vault, copied over 12 million of their images, and used them to build a machine that now directly competes with them. This lawsuit brought a new level of firepower to the anti-AI side. Getty Images has a legal budget that could probably fund a small country. They are famously, almost legendary, for their aggressive defense of their copyrights. This is a company that will send you a four-figure legal notice if you accidentally use one of their images in your church newsletter and they had just discovered that their entire, meticulously curated, and very expensive library had been treated like a free-for-all buffet by an AI startup. To say they were displeased would be an understatement, but Getty didn't just come with accusations. They came with the most perfect, damning, and frankly hilarious piece of evidence imaginable. The smoking gun. As users played around with Stable Diffusion, they started noticing something weird. Sometimes, in the AI-generated images of fantastical landscapes or photorealistic portraits, a ghostly, mangled, semi-coherent shape would appear in the corner. It looked like a smeared, drunken signature, and when you looked closer, you could just make it out. It was the Getty Images watermark. This was a catastrophic, unforced error on Stability AI's part. It was the single best piece of evidence the artists and lawyers could have dreamed of. Why? Because it completely torched the industry's main defense, the pristine, abstract idea that the AI learns, but doesn't copy. The AI's defenders claim the model doesn't store JPEGs, just a mathematical understanding of concepts. Okay, fine. Then how in the world did it learn the watermark? The watermark isn't a concept like dog or tree. It is a specific, copyrighted, proprietary logo that signifies ownership. Its appearance in the output was concrete proof that the model wasn't just learning from the images, it was memorizing and regurgitating specific parts of them, right down to the brand name of the company it was stealing from. Cue the brutal cause and effect chain. Cause, in its rush to scrape as much data as possible, Stability AI ingests millions of Getty Images photos without bothering to scrub the prominent watermarks. Effect, the Stable Diffusion model learns the watermark as a visual pattern that frequently appears in high-quality images, and sometimes reproduces a distorted version of it in its outputs. Consequence, Getty Images is gifted an undeniable piece of evidence for its lawsuit, and the AI industry's central learning, not copying defense is severely, perhaps fatally, undermined. The meta-commentary here is just pure, chef's kiss irony. It's the kind of poetic justice you usually only see in movies. It is a bank robber getting caught because he accidentally tattooed the bank's logo on his forehead during the heist. Stability AI had been so brazen, so utterly indiscriminate in its data collection, that it had inadvertently created a permanent, algorithmically generated confession of its own sins. Every time the model spat out that garbled watermark, it was basically whispering, PSST. I got this part from Getty Images. The Getty lawsuit legitimized the artist fight in the eyes of the corporate and financial worlds. When it was just indie creators, it was easy for venture capitalists and tech journalists to dismiss the complaints as the fear of a few artisans being made obsolete by progress. But you cannot dismiss Getty Images. They are a pillar of the creative economy, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Their lawsuit sent a clear signal to Wall Street. The legal risk attached to generative AI is not a fringe concern. It's a C-suite, balance sheet threatening, 5-alarm fire. Now, Stability AI was fighting a two-front war. On one side, a passionate class action lawsuit representing the soul of the creative class. On the other, a cold-blooded corporate behemoth fighting for its market share. The pressure was mounting from all sides, the legal challenges were existential, and the artist community's technical sabotage was growing. Faced with this multi-pronged assault, the AI companies decided it was time for some damage control. They would offer an olive branch, a way out, a solution. But as we'll soon see, their idea of a solution looked suspiciously like making the victims do all the work. The walls were closing in. Stability AI was now being sued by a coalition of artists on one coast and a corporate photography empire on the other. Artists were actively trying to poison their future datasets. The PR narrative had shifted from magical art robot for everyone to the biggest art heist in history. The AI companies, feeling the heat, knew they had to do something. They needed to look like they were listening. They needed to offer a concession, an olive branch, a solution. And so, with the feigned grace of a king offering breadcrumbs to a restive peasantry, they unveiled their grand idea, the opt-out portal. Websites like Have I Been Trained popped up, presented as a magnanimous gesture of goodwill. The premise was simple. Artists could now visit this website, search a database of the 5.8 billion images in the Lion dataset, and if they found their work, they could fill out a form to have it excluded from future training runs. DeviantArt implemented a similar flag that artists could apply to their work. On the surface, it almost sounded reasonable. "We hear you," the company seemed to say. "You want control over your work. Here it is." Except it wasn't a solution. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting, a gesture so insulting and cynically designed that it poured fuel on the fire it was meant to extinguish. The artistic community rejected it, not just as inadequate, but as a profound moral offense. Here's why this olive branch was actually a stick covered in thorns. First, and most importantly, it placed the entire burden of labor on the victim. Think about the sheer arrogance. A company spends millions of dollars to build an automated system to scrape your life's work without your permission. Then, when you complain, their solution is to make you, the artist, spend countless unpaid hours of your own time searching their colossal database and archive of their crime. To manually flag your own stolen property, an artist with a portfolio of 1,000 images would have to do 1,000 searches and 1,000 takedown requests. It was a second, unpaid job. And the job was clean up the mess we made while profiting from your work. Second, the gesture was almost entirely symbolic because you can't untrain an AI. The models that were already built Stable Diffusion 1.5, Midjourney V4, etc. had already ingested the data, the knowledge, the patterns. The styles were already baked into the billions of parameters of the neural network. Removing an image from the dataset for the next version, for Stable Diffusion 3.0 or for 4.0, did absolutely nothing to fix the models that were currently out in the world, actively competing with artists. The horse hadn't just left the barn, it had been cloned. And the clones were now running a glue factory across the street. The offer was to maybe not steal your next horse. Let's trace the logic here, because it is a perfect loop of corporate nonsense, cause, facing a massive public and legal backlash. AI companies need a PR-friendly way to demonstrate that they respect creators. Effect, they launch opt-out tools, which shift the responsibility for data management from the multi-billion-dollar corporation to the individual, often struggling, artist. Consequence, this backfires spectacularly. Instead of calming the outrage, the opt-out portals become a symbol of the industry's bad faith, further radicalizing the artists and demonstrating that the companies fundamentally do not understand or do not care about the concept of prior consent. The meta commentary practically writes itself. This is like a burglar who breaks into every house in a neighborhood, photocopies everyone's private journals, and then, when confronted, sets up a little kiosk in the town square with a sign that says, "Did I photocopy your diary? Search our database and file a request to have it excluded from my next volume of Neighborhood Secrets." It's not an apology, it's not a solution. It's a continuation of the violation under the guise of customer service. It's an administrative task designed to exhaust the victims into submission. This fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the complaint. The artist's argument was, "Please make it slightly more convenient for me to remove my work after you've already exploited it." Their argument was, "You never had the right to take it in the first place." The only acceptable system, from their perspective, was an opt-in system, where data is only used after obtaining explicit, affirmative consent from the creator. The AI industry's refusal to even consider this revealed their true position. They believed they were entitled to the data, and their opt-out portal was merely a minor concession to quiet the noise. The backlash was swift and brutal. The opt-out solution became another Exhibit A in the legal cases against them, proof of their cavalier attitude towards copyright. It showed that the problem wasn't a mistake, it was the business model. And while the visual artists were fuming over these gloriously useless web forms, the shockwaves of the data heist were beginning to ripple into another creative domain. The machines, after all, weren't just looking at JPEGs. The T in GPT stands for transformer, and it was trained on text. A lot of text. The writers, the journalists, and the novelists were about to wake up and realize their libraries had been looted, too. The battle lines, it turned out, were not just visual, while the illustrators, painters, and photographers were busy fighting over pixels and watermarks. A parallel crisis was brewing in the world of words. The same AI labs that had trained their image models on a diet of DeviantArt And Pinterest had also been feeding their language models the brains behind chatbots like ChatGPT. A similarly gargantuan meal, this one wasn't made of JPEGs, but of text, petabytes of text, scraped from every corner of the internet. And that included every news article, every book, every blog post, every Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation ever published, and in late December 2023, one of the oldest and most powerful word factories on the planet decided it wanted a word. The New York Times sued OpenAI and its primary investor, Microsoft. This was not another class action suit from a scrappy coalition. This was a declaration of war from a 172-year-old institution that has more resources, more lawyers, and more sheer institutional gravity than most governments. The old gray lady, as the paper is affectionately known, had entered the brawl. And she did not come to play. The lawsuit was a meticulously documented, deeply researched, and utterly scathing indictment of OpenAI's entire business model. The Times' argument was elegant and brutal. For over a century, they had invested, as they put it, hundreds of millions of dollars in producing high-quality, independent journalism. This journalism, millions of articles representing the work of thousands of reporters, was their product, their property, and OpenAI, they alleged, had simply taken all of it. They'd scraped the Times' entire archive, fed it into their machine, and used it to build a product, Shacked, that was now a direct and existential competitor to the New York Times itself. Why? The lawsuit asked. Would anyone pay for a subscription to the Times when they could just ask Shacked to summarize a Times article, or even provide answers based directly on Times reporting, for free? But they didn't stop there. The Times came with receipts, devastating, undeniable receipts. Their lawyers had spent months baiting Shacked, crafting specific prompts to see what it would do. And they discovered its fatal flaw. The model didn't just learn from the articles. It memorized them. The lawsuit was filled with stunning, side-by-side exhibits showing Shacked spitting out massive, near-verbatim chunks of paywalled New York Times articles with a little clever prompting. The chatbot became a pirating machine, reproducing copyrighted work that was supposed to be locked behind a subscription. This evidence was a torpedo aimed directly at the hull of the AI industry's fair use defense. Here is the chain of events that led to the explosion. Cause, after months of tense and ultimately fruitless negotiations to try and get OpenAI to pay for a content license, the New York Times realizes its entire archive has already been used to train the very models that are now devaluing its core product. Effect, the Times legal team meticulously documents cases where Shacked can be prompted to regurgitate entire paragraphs of its copyrighted articles, providing a smoking gun. That contradicts the transformative learning narrative. Consequence, a massive lawsuit is filed, expanding the AI copyright war from visual art to journalism. The clear evidence of verbatim memorization severely weakens OpenAI's fair use argument and poses an existential threat to the company. The meta commentary is just delicious. For over a year, OpenAI had cultivated an image of creating a truly intelligent, almost magical system that could reason and create. The New York Times lawsuit revealed that, in some cases, the magic was just a really good memory. The brilliant student wasn't synthesizing new ideas. He was caught with the textbook open under his desk, frantically copying the answers word for word. It was a fundamental blow to the company's carefully crafted mystique. They hadn't just built an intelligence, they'd built the world's most sophisticated plagiarist. This lawsuit was a game changer. It represented the interests of not just one newspaper, but the entire publishing and news gathering industry. Every publisher, from the Wall Street Journal to the smallest local paper, was watching. If the Times succeeded, it would establish a precedent that the raw material of journalism has value, and that AI companies couldn't just take it for free. It would force a fundamental rethinking of the scrape it all and ask questions later approach that had defined the AI gold rush. The battlefront was now officially a chaotic, multi-front war. On one flank, the visual artists and their data poisoning insurgency. On another, the corporate might of Getty Images, defending its watermark territory. And now, charging right up the middle, was the full legal and moral weight of the Fourth Estate, defending the value of factual reporting. The AI industry was collecting powerful enemies like they were Pokémon cards. And all this noise, all these lawsuits and public battles, were starting to attract the attention of a group that tech companies usually try their best to avoid: the government. The politicians were starting to wake up, and they were very confused. With the creative world corporate giants and the global press now officially at war with the AI industry, the sheer volume of noise, of lawsuits, of outrage, of existential panic finally became loud enough to penetrate the soundproofed walls of government. In Washington, D.C., in Brussels, in London, politicians who were still grappling with the complexities of the smartphone suddenly found themselves tasked with regulating a technology that proponents claimed was the next step in human evolution. The legislators, bless their hearts, were finally waking up, and they were hopelessly, hilariously, and dangerously out of their depth. What followed was a now familiar ritual of the 21st century, the tech CEO congressional hearing. OpenAI Sam Altman, the public face of the AI revolution, was summoned before the United States Senate. The scene was a perfect microcosm of our modern power dynamic. On one side, a young, articulate CEO in a tailored suit, calmly explaining a technology of near-infinite complexity. On the other, a panel of senators, average age hovering somewhere around 68, who looked at the flowcharts prepared by their aides with the same bewildered expression. A cat gives a chessboard. The hearings were a surreal spectacle of generational and technical disconnect. Senators stumbled over basic terminology, asking questions that revealed a grasp of the technology so tenuous it felt like performance art. They'd ask about the algorithm as if it were a single, mischievous gremlin living inside the machine. They struggled to differentiate between AI and the internet itself. One infamous exchange involved a senator asking how AI companies could possibly police their users, a question that tech leaders have been elegantly dodging since the invention of the social media like button. It was like watching a group of blacksmiths try to regulate a nuclear reactor. They knew it was powerful and potentially dangerous, but they had absolutely no idea how it worked, what it was made of, or what any of the blinking lights meant. This, of course, is a feature, not a bug, of modern governance. Here as the predictable chain of events cause, a new technology erupts into the public consciousness, creating a mixture of awe and panic. High-profile lawsuits and media firestorms create immense public pressure on politicians to do something. Effect: governments hold public hearings, summoning tech CEOs to Washington. These hearings generate dramatic sound bites and give the appearance of oversight, while in reality serving as a basic, remedial tech class for the lawmakers. Consequence: the legislative process begins at a crawl, immediately getting bogged down in partisan squabbling and intense lobbying from the multi-trillion-dollar tech industry. The result is a massive gap where the technology advances exponentially while the laws meant to govern it are still being debated in committee. The meta commentary is that we are trapped in a deeply tragic comic loop. The people with the power to write the laws fundamentally do not understand the thing they are trying to regulate, and the people who do understand the technology have a vested financial interest in ensuring those laws are as weak, vague, and full of loopholes as possible. Tech CEOs have perfected the art of regulatory capture, showing up to these hearings, looking contrite, agreeing that, yes, regulation is needed, and then graciously offering to help write it. It's the fox not just guarding the henhouse, but kindly offering to help design the locks. While the US was stuck in this theatrical loop, the European Union was, as usual, taking a more direct approach with its ambitious AI Act. This was a sprawling, comprehensive piece of legislation, years in the making, attempting to create a risk-based framework for all AI systems. It was a noble effort, but it also highlighted the core problem, the speed mismatch. The AI Act was being drafted and debated for years. In that same time frame, generative AI went from a niche academic concept to a global consumer product. By the time the ink is dry on any of these laws, the technology they were designed to regulate will be 2 or 3 generations more advanced, operating on principles the drafters never even considered. This legislative vacuum was, for all intents and purposes, a victory for the AI labs. While governments dithered, they were free to continue deploying their systems, gathering more data, and integrating their products so deeply into our digital infrastructure that they would become effectively impossible to remove. The strategy is to make your technology too big to fail before the regulators can even agree on a definition of what it is. So, as the politicians stared blankly at their binders, struggling to understand the difference between a neural network and a social network, the actual developers and engineers in the AI industry were refining their arguments. They were preparing a defense that went deeper than the simple learning analogy. They were about to double down on the "it's just math" defense, taking it to a level of abstraction that would make the senators' heads spin even faster. The philosophical debate was about to get a whole lot more technical. While the politicians were busy asking their aides to Google what is an algorithm, the actual engineers and developers behind the AI models decided it was time to upgrade their defense. The simple, folksy analogy of the AI as a human student was starting to fall apart. The inconvenient evidence of memorization, the Getty watermarks, The verbatim New York Times articles kept poking holes in that narrative, so they wheeled out the big guns. They switched from a behavioral defense to a mathematical one. This was the PhD level, it's just math, bro argument. And it was designed to be so technically intimidating that it would short-circuit the brain of any lawyer, judge, or artist who tried to argue with it. The argument goes something like this: the AI model, particularly a diffusion model like Stable Diffusion, doesn't store copies of images. It doesn't even really store a simple statistical understanding of them. The process is far more abstract. The AI is trained by taking billions of images and systematically destroying them. By adding layers of digital static or noise, it then learns how to reverse that process. It learns how to start with pure, random noise and, guided by a text prompt, gradually denwa it into a brand new, coherent image. The magic, they argue, happens in a place called latent space. Latent space is the ultimate technical smokescreen, in the simplest possible terms. It's a compressed, multi-dimensional mathematical map of all the concepts the AI has learned. There isn't a folder of cats in the AI's brain. Instead, there's a specific point in this vast, conceptual matrix that represents the mathematical idea of catness. Nearby points might represent lion or furry. Faraway points might represent skyscraper or sadness when you type a prompt. The AI isn't grabbing a picture. It is plotting a course through this conceptual space and then generating the pixels that correspond to that specific mathematical address. Let's try a music analogy. It's like the AI isn't storing an MP3 of Hey Jude. Instead, it listens to the entire Beatles catalog and reverse engineers the fundamental mathematical rules of a Beatles song, the specific chord progressions they favored, the harmonic structures, the lyrical patterns. The latent space is that set of rules. The AI can then use those rules to compose a brand new song that sounds uncannily like the Beatles, but has never existed before. The argument, therefore, is that the new song isn't a copy. It's an original work generated from a deep, mathematical understanding of the source material. This more sophisticated defense was a direct reaction to the industry as growing legal peril. Cause the initial, simplistic learning analogy proves the weak and is easily contradicted by evidence of the models regurgitating their training data. Effect, the defense pivots to a highly technical explanation involving complex mathematical concepts like latent space and diffusion models, arguing the process is one of abstract conceptual mapping, not replication. Consequence, this creates a massive information asymmetry in the courtroom and the court of public opinion. It's an argument designed to be unassailable by non-experts, making the AI's process sound like objective, pure science, far removed from the grubby business of copyright infringement. But the meta commentary here is that this is just a more elaborate way of saying the same morally hollow thing. This is complexity laundering. It's using a wall of jargon to hide the simple, foundational sin. Who cares if the AI stores a JPEG or a probabilistic vector in a high-dimensional manifold? The latent space, this magical map of ideas, did not spring fully formed from the ether. It is a direct mathematical derivative of the billions of images that were fed into it. It is a monumentally complex summary of a library of stolen books. The elegant math doesn't excuse the initial trespass, it merely describes the intricate method by which the stolen goods were processed. This argument is so effective because it's also, in a way, what the developers truly believe. They see the beauty and the complexity of the mathematics they are working with, and become convinced of its purity. They see themselves not as data thieves, but as scientists and explorers, mapping a new frontier of intelligence. From their perspective, the artist's complaints about copyright are a failure to appreciate the sublime elegance of the algorithm. This creates a cultural chasm that is almost impossible to bridge. One side is talking about their livelihood, their identity, and their rights. The other side is talking about stochastic gradient descent. So the defense was set to the public. They would use the simple student in a library analogy to the courts and the regulators. They would deploy the intimidating it as all just abstract math in a latent space argument. Both were designed to distract from the one question they never wanted to answer: did you have permission to take the data in the first place? And while the developers were busy admiring the philosophical purity of their mathematical creations, another group of people were admiring something else entirely: the astronomical sums of money this whole enterprise was generating. While the developers were waxing poetic about the mathematical elegance of latent space, and the lawyers were sharpening their arguments about the definition of transformative, a very different conversation was happening in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. This conversation wasn't about ethics or art, it was about numbers, specifically numbers with a whole lot of zeros after them. Because while the copyright debate was a messy, philosophical quagmire, the business of AI was a rocket ship, and every venture capitalist on Earth wanted a ticket to ride. The year 2023 will be remembered as the Great AI Gold Rush. The public release of ChatGPT and the explosion of AI-generated art kicked off a full-blown investment mania, a tidal wave of cash so enormous it made the dot-com bubble look like a quaint garden party. The logic was simple and brutally effective. This technology was clearly the future, and if you weren't investing in it, you were destined to become a fossil. The FOMO, the fear of missing out, reached a fever pitch. A fire hose of money was aimed directly at anyone with a half-decent AI pitch deck. The valuations were staggering, completely detached from traditional metrics like revenue or profit. OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT and DALL-E, saw its valuation soar past $80 billion, fueled by a colossal $10 billion investment from Microsoft. Stability AI, the scrappy open-source champion being sued by literally everyone, had raised over $100 million at a valuation of $1 billion, making it an instant unicorn. Dozens of other startups, many with no actual product, were raising tens of millions of dollars based on little more than a good idea and a team of qualified engineers. It was a speculative frenzy of historic proportions, and here we arrive at the spectacular, beating heart of the hypocrisy. Juxtapose those billion-dollar numbers with the amount of money these companies paid to license the data that made it all possible. That number, of course, was zero, an $80 billion company, built on a foundation of raw material acquired for free. A billion-dollar company whose primary asset was a model trained on the uncompensated labor of millions of artists and writers. They weren't just building a new technology. They were pioneering a new business model, how to build a corporate empire without paying for your most critical resource. This financial reality reveals the entire game. Let's follow the money, 'cause the viral, world-changing potential of generative AI becomes undeniable, creating a massive hype cycle and triggering a frantic rush of investment from venture capitalists, terrified of being left behind. Effect: AI companies are suddenly flooded with billions of dollars, giving them near-infinite resources to hire the best talent, buy the most powerful computer chips, and crucially, retain the most expensive and aggressive lawyers. Consequence: the already lopsided battle becomes even more skewed. The individual artists and writers, many of whom are struggling to make a living, now find themselves fighting a legal and political war against a new multi-trillion-dollar industrial complex that was built using their own work as kindling. The meta commentary is that this is the Silicon Valley playbook perfected. Step 1. Identify a vast, valuable, and legally ambiguous resource, in this case, the entire creative output of humanity on the internet. Step 2. Build a technology that can scrape and process this resource at an industrial scale. Step 3. Release a magical product that captures the public imagination and triggers a venture capital feeding frenzy. Step 4. Achieve a colossal valuation and market dominance. Step 5. And this is the crucial one. Use your newfound wealth and power to retroactively legitimize your business model, either by lobbying to change the laws or by crushing any legal challenges through sheer financial exhaustion. It's not move fast and break things. It's move fast, take things, get rich, and then dare the world to do something about it. The language used by the investors and founders during this period was a masterclass in self-serving rhetoric. They spoke of democratizing creativity, unlocking human potential, and building Augie for the benefit of all humanity. It was a beautiful, utopian vision that conveniently ignored the fact that the first step in this grand project involved the largest uncredited, uncompensated appropriation of creative work in human history. The creators of this work weren't seen as partners to be compensated. They were an externality to be managed, a legacy system being disrupted. This ocean of cash wasn't just a number on a balance sheet, it was a weapon. It meant the AI companies could afford to drag out the lawsuits for a decade if they had to. It meant they could hire armies of lobbyists to whisper in the ears of the confused politicians in Washington and Brussels. It meant they could fund their own AI safety and ethics research to create the appearance of self-regulation. The money provided a protective shield, allowing them to continue their work while the rest of the world scrambled to catch up. The injustice was staggering. The very people whose creativity fueled the gold rush were left outside in the cold, while the tech prospectors who had mined their work were celebrating their newfound fortunes. But this glaring ethical void in the market was so obvious, so profound, that it was only a matter of time before someone tried to fill it. In the chaotic, smoldering wreckage of the AI industry's public image, a few clever corporations saw not a crisis, but a business opportunity. The biggest names in generative AI: OpenAI, Stability AI, Midjourney were now permanently stained with the reputation of having built their empires on a foundation of stolen data. They were powerful, yes, but they were also legally and ethically radioactive. This created a gaping hole in the market for an AI that came with a clean conscience. And so began the great ethical AI gold rush, where corporations began desperately marketing their new models as if they were conflict-free diamonds or artisanal, fair trade coffee beans. The undisputed champion of this new movement was Adobe. For months, the creative world had been looking at Adobe, the company that owns Photoshop and effectively runs the digital art world, and wondering when they would enter the fray. When they finally did, their strategy was a masterstroke of corporate jiu-jitsu. They unveiled their own AI image generator, Adobe Firefly, with a single, killer marketing message. It was commercially safe. How? By not being evil, or at least, by not being as flagrantly reckless as their competitors. Adobe announced that Firefly was trained exclusively onto sources, images, from its own massive Adobe stock library, and works that were in the public domain. This was a paradigm shift. The contributors to Adobe stock had already signed licensing agreements that gave Adobe broad rights to use their work, and by training a model on that data, Adobe could confidently tell its vast customer base from solo freelance designers to the world's biggest advertising agencies that anything generated with Firefly was legally squeaky clean and indemnified. They wouldn't have to worry about a Getty Images watermark suddenly appearing in their new soda ad. To sweeten the deal, Adobe also announced a plan to develop a compensation model for the stock artists whose work was used in the training data. They had listened to every single complaint the artists had leveled against Stability AI and built a product that was the exact opposite. Other giants quickly followed suit. Getty Images, in a move of spectacular corporate multitasking, was simultaneously suing Stability AI for scraping its content, while partnering with the tech behemoth NVIDIA to launch its own generative AI, the training data. For this new model, Getty's own, fully licensed, and meticulously cataloged library. The pitch was simple: you want the power of AI without the billion-dollar legal headache. Use our tool. It might be less creatively chaotic than Midjourney, but you won't get a subpoena in the mail. This led to a new and fascinating market dynamic. Cause: the enormous legal and reputational risk created by the scrape-it-all approach of the first-wave AI companies creates a massive demand from corporate customers for a legally defensible alternative. Effect: established companies sitting on huge, proprietary libraries of licensed content like Adobe and Getty realize they are sitting on a data goldmine and rush to build their own ethical AI models. Consequence: the AI market bifurcates. It splits into the Wild West models, incredibly powerful but legally dubious, and the walled garden models, which are safer, more controlled, and explicitly designated for commercial use. This puts immense pressure on the original players to clean up their act. The meta commentary here is that we have to view this ethical AI branding through a thick, bulletproof lens of corporate sarcasm. Was this move better for artists than the alternative? Unquestionably, yes, but was it driven by pure, altruistic concern for creative rights? Absolutely not. It was a genius business strategy. Adobe saw a disruptive technology threatening to upend its entire ecosystem. Instead of fighting it, they co-opted it. They leveraged their biggest existing asset, their stock library, to create a competing product that was perfectly tailored to their existing risk-averse corporate clients. Ethics wasn't just a moral position, it was a killer feature, a competitive advantage, a moat to protect their castle. This schism had a profound impact. While hobbyists and solo creators might continue to use the more powerful and flexible tools like Midjourney, any serious business, any company with a legal department would now have a very strong incentive to use the commercially safe alternatives. Why would a movie studio risk using a tool trained on stolen art to design a poster when they could use Adobe Firefly and be completely covered? This move by Adobe and Getty didn't just create a new product, it created a new professional standard, forcing the entire industry to start taking data provenance seriously. The rise of these clean models was a major victory for the artists, proving that a different, more equitable path was possible. It validated their central argument that building this technology did not require a flagrant disregard for copyright. But even as the market began to slowly correct itself, a deeper, more technical problem remained. The issue wasn't just where the data came from, but how you could prove it. In a world of infinitely replicable digital files, how could you track an image's journey from a human creator into an AI's latent space and back out again? The old school Highly visible watermark was clearly not enough. The war over data provenance was about to go cryptographic. While the market was busy sorting itself into ethical and YOLO camps, a quieter, far nerdier war was being waged in the background. This was a battle fought at the level of individual pixels and cryptographic keys. The accidental appearance of the Getty Images watermark was a fluke, a lucky break, but it exposed a fundamental problem in the digital age. How do you prove where a piece of content came from? How do you reliably distinguish between a human-made photograph and a synthetic image generated by an AI that has studied 1 billion photographs? The old-fashioned visible watermark was a flimsy wooden shield in an age of algorithmic machine guns. The world needed a better system. The world needed an invisible watermark. The goal was to create a digital fingerprint, a signature embedded directly into the fabric of an image that would be imperceptible to the human eye but easily readable by a computer. This signature would need to be incredibly robust, capable of surviving compression, cropping, color correction, and most importantly, the statistical meat grinder of an AI training process. This wasn't just about copyright, it was about reality itself. With the rise of hyper-realistic deepfakes and AI-generated misinformation, the internet was rapidly becoming a zero-trust environment, where nothing could be taken at face value. We needed a new system for authenticating truth. Enter the delightfully corporate-sounding Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, or C2PA. This was a consortium of the tech industry's heavy hitters: Adobe, Microsoft, Intel, Sony, the responsible adults in the room. They teamed up to create a technical standard for content credentials. Think of it as a mandatory, tamper-proof digital nutrition label for every photo, video, and audio file. In this utopian vision, every piece of content would carry its own signed passport, detailing its entire life story: when it was created, by what device or person, how it was edited, and crucially, whether it was generated by an AI. On the other side of this battle were startups and researchers, developing more direct, aggressive watermarking techniques. These methods could embed information into an image that would not only identify it as AI-generated, but could even, in theory, disrupt or poison a model that tried to train on it without permission. The invisible watermark became both a shield and a sword. This led to the inevitable high-tech arms race. Here as the cycle, cause, the unstoppable flood of synthetic media, creates a profound crisis of authenticity, threatening everything from intellectual property to national security. Effect: a coalition of tech giants and startups races to develop and standardize a system of invisible watermarks and content credentials to track the provenance of all digital media. Consequence: this immediately sparks a counter-movement for every new watermarking system designed. A new AI tool will be developed specifically to detect and erase that watermark. The conflict descends into a deeply technical, perpetual cat and mouse game. The meta commentary here is just a deep, world-weary sigh. We have finally reached the point in our cyberpunk dystopia where we need a global, cryptographically secured bureaucracy just to verify that a picture of a flower is a real picture of a real flower. We have broken our information ecosystem so thoroughly that the only proposed solution is to wrap every single piece of content in layers of complex, energy-intensive code. This isn't a simple patch, it's a permanent, clunky, and fragile layer of technological scaffolding we are being forced to build on top of the ruins of the old, high-trust internet. It is the boring, administrative, and deeply necessary cost of the AI revolution. This arms race is a war that can never truly be won. It's a permanent state of technological conflict. A watermarking system is released. A month later, a tool called Watermark Be Gone appears on a developer forum. The C2PA updates its standard. A new AI model is trained to specifically generate images that fool the C2PA's verification tool. It's an endless loop of measure and countermeasure. A silent war fought in research papers and code repositories, with the very concept of objective reality as the battlefield. So while the lawyers argued in court and the VCs celebrated their paper fortunes, the engineers were engaged in this far more fundamental struggle. They were trying to rebuild the concept of trust from the ground up, using the only tools they had, algorithms and cryptography. But while the private sector was busy building these elaborate technological solutions, the public sector, the slow, confused, but ultimately powerful world of government was about to make a move. And in one country, a government that had been sprinting headfirst towards an AI-friendly future was about to trip, fall, and do a complete, spectacular face plant. While the tech industry was busy building its invisible watermarks and ethical walled gardens, the slow, chaotic, and often confused machinery of government was grinding away in the background. For the most part, This involved a lot of pointless hearings and empty promises, but in one country, the government decided to stop talking and actually do something. And that something was to propose a policy so brazenly, catastrophically anti-creator that it served as a global wake-up call. The country was the United Kingdom, and the incident proved a vital lesson. Sometimes, the machine blinks in the heady, post-Brexit scramble for a new economic identity. The UK government decided it was going to become a world-leading AI superpower. This was the new brand. To make Britain the most attractive place on earth for AI companies to set up shop, they needed to offer something special, a competitive advantage. And they landed on a truly radical idea. What if they just got rid of copyright? At least as far as AI was concerned. The UK's Intellectual Property Office proposed a new, breathtakingly broad copyright exception for text and data mining. This new rule would allow anyone to mine any data, including copyrighted books, music, and art for any purpose, as long as they had lawful access to it. Let's be perfectly clear about what this meant. Lawful access just means you're not hacking into a server. If a work is on the public internet, you have lawful access. This proposal would have made the entire scrape and all business model of Stability AI and OpenAI completely, unambiguously legal in the United Kingdom. It was a formal invitation for the AI industry to come and feast on the corpse of the nation's creative output. It was the ultimate betrayal. A government actively proposing to sacrifice its own world-renowned creative industries on the altar of big tech. The proposal landed with the force of a nuclear bomb. The reaction was not just negative, it was an instantaneous, unified, and utterly ferocious firestorm of opposition. For the first time in this entire conflict, the entire creative sector rose up as one. It wasn't just the visual artists, it was the musicians' unions, the authors' guilds, the Society of Photographers, the publishers' associations, the film industry, everyone. They saw this for what it was, an existential threat, a cultural suicide note written by their own government. Their argument was simple and devastating. The UK's creative industries are a global powerhouse, worth over £100 billion to the economy. Why on earth would you legalize the systematic theft of our most valuable assets to benefit a handful of foreign tech companies? The political calculus proved to be a spectacular miscalculation. Here's the chain of events. Cause in a desperate bid for a post-Brexit economic win. The UK government tries to position itself as the world's most permissive regulatory haven for AI development. Effect, they propose a copyright exception so extreme that it galvanizes the country's entire creative economy into a state of open, furious rebellion. Consequence, faced with an apocalyptic level of backlash from a coalition of beloved authors, famous musicians, and powerful industry groups, the government performs a sudden, humiliating, and complete U-turn, scrapping the proposal entirely. The meta commentary here is that this was a rare and beautiful thing to witness. It was the moment the Silicon Valley mantra of technological inevitability ran headfirst into a brick wall of organized human rage and actually lost. For months, the narrative had been that AI was an unstoppable force of nature that creators just had to adapt to. The UK's spectacular backflip proved that was a lie. It proved that a government, when presented with a clear choice and sufficient political pressure, could be forced to protect its people over abstract promises of technological progress. It was a stunning victory for the creative resistance. The reversal was swift. In early 2023, the proposal was a key part of their AI strategy. A few months later, after a relentless campaign of public letters, blistering editorials, and frantic lobbying, the Minister for Science, Innovation and Technology stood before Parliament and officially killed the plan. The government had blinked. They had stared into the abyss of a full-scale war with their own culture and decided to back down. This event sent shockwaves far beyond the UK. It was a cautionary tale for every other government, especially the United States, that was considering a light-touch regulatory approach. It demonstrated that there was a massive, politically potent constituency that cared deeply about creative rights, and that ignoring them was perilous. It was a massive morale boost for the global artist movement, the first major, unambiguous political win in the war against the scrapers. But while the UK's creative class was celebrating their hard-won victory, another front in the American legal battle was about to open. The writers were getting organized, and this time, their lawsuit had a very famous and very funny face attached to it. The victory in the UK was a massive morale boost, a political win that proved the AI juggernaut could be stopped. But the main event, the grinding legal war, was still being fought in the American courts. The battlefronts were already crowded with visual artists, with Getty Images, with the New York Times, And in the summer of 2023, a new regiment arrived, and they brought a celebrity general. The authors were back, and this time they were led by comedian and writer Sarah Silverman. Silverman, along with several other prominent authors like Christopher Golden and Richard Kadri, filed a series of class action lawsuits that took aim at the two biggest names in large language models, OpenAI, the creator of Chat, and Meta, the company behind Facebook, for its own powerful AI model, Llama. Their complaint was elegantly simple and deeply damning. They argued that these AI models could, on command, produce incredibly detailed and accurate summaries of their copyrighted books. So accurate, in fact, that the AI had to have been trained on the full text of the books themselves. Their life's work, their novels, their memoirs all had been fed into the machine and turned into an uncredited ghostwriter. This wasn't just a rehash of the artist-style mimicry argument. This came with a new, explosive piece of evidence that pointed to an even more flagrant form of lawlessness. The author's lawyers asked a crucial question: where would a company like OpenAI or Meta get digital copies of hundreds of thousands of copyrighted books to train its AI? Many of these books aren't freely available in their entirety on the public web. The lawsuit offered a chilling and entirely plausible answer. They got them from shadow libraries. For the uninitiated, shadow libraries are the dark web of the literary world. They are massive, illegal, pirate websites. Names like Z Library, Library Genesis, and Sci-Hub are infamous that contain colossal, pirated archives of copyrighted books, textbooks, and academic papers. They are the boogeyman of the publishing industry, a one-stop shop for illicitly obtained knowledge. And the lawsuit alleged that the AI labs had treated these vast pirate coves as just another data source, another library to be scraped and ingested. This allegation was a game changer. It blew a hole clean through the already tattered "we just scraped the public web" defense. Here's the chain of events. Cause authors discover that AI chatbots can summarize their books with a level of detail that proves the models ingested the entire text, not just reviews or snippets. Effect: a high-profile, celebrity-led lawsuit is filed, which formally alleges that the AI company sourced this content from massive, notoriously illegal shadow libraries. Consequence: the legal case against AI Labs is no longer just about the ethically gray area of web scraping. It's now about straight-up, unambiguous piracy. This severely damages the AI industry's public image and legal standing, painting them as beneficiaries of large-scale digital theft. The Meta commentary here is just dripping with schadenfreude. It's one thing to have a high-concept legal debate about whether training an AI is transformative fair use. It's another thing entirely to be accused of fueling your multi-billion-dollar revolution with data you downloaded from a pirate site. The AI as a student analogy completely falls apart when you realize the student built his brilliant thesis by studying from a truckload of stolen textbooks he bought from a guy in an alley. It strips away any pretense of innocence or high-minded intellectual curiosity. If the allegations are true, it means these companies didn't just bend the rules. They knowingly and willingly benefited from a criminal enterprise. The Silverman lawsuit brought a new level of mainstream attention to the copyright fight. A legal dispute involving arcane concepts like latent space is hard for the public to grasp. A story about a beloved comedian accusing a giant tech company of training its robots on pirated books. That's a story everyone can understand. It's simple. It's visceral. It's a classic David versus Goliath tale with an added layer of digital piracy. This put OpenAI and Meta in an incredibly uncomfortable position. They had always been deliberately vague about the precise contents of their training datasets, calling them trade secrets. Now, they were facing legal pressure to reveal whether their secret sauce included ingredients sourced from the biggest pirate operations on the internet. The entire conflict was getting messier, the accusations more severe. The legal battles in the US were setting the stage for a years-long conflict over the very soul of intellectual property. But the US is not the world, and while American artists were suing and UK artists were lobbying, a very different conversation was happening on the other side of the planet. A conversation that was about to make Japan the unlikely Wild West of the AI world. As the legal armies clashed in the courtrooms of California, and the politicians fumbled in the halls of Washington and London, a strange and confusing signal began to emerge from the East. While the Western world was consumed by a fiery debate over copyright, consent, and compensation, the government of Japan seemed to be taking a radically different path. It appeared, to the astonishment of the global creative community, that Japan was on the verge of declaring itself a legal paradise for AI developers, a place where the pesky business of asking for Permission simply didn't apply. It was poised to become the world's first AI data haven. This bizarre situation stemmed from a piece of legislation passed in 2018, a lifetime ago in AI years, long before the generative art explosion. An amendment to Japan's copyright law, specifically Article 34, was designed to boost big data analysis and research. It created a broad exception allowing the use of copyrighted works for information analysis, as long as it was for a non-enjoyment purpose. The logic was that if a computer is just analyzing the statistical properties of a book to study language patterns, it's not enjoying the novel in the way a human reader does. Therefore, a license shouldn't be required. For years, this obscure provision sat quietly on the books, intended for academics and data scientists. Then, in 2023, with the generative AI debate raging globally, Japan's Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology was asked about it. He confirmed the government's stance. The law, as written, permitted AI models to be trained on any copyrighted work without permission from the creator. The news ripped through the international tech community like a shockwave, a get-out-of-jail-free card, a whole country where scraping was not only tolerated but seemingly protected by law. Venture capitalists and AI labs started looking at Tokyo with hearts in their eyes. But inside Japan, the reaction was not excitement, it was sheer, unadulterated panic. The country's legendary anime and manga industries, the twin pillars of its global cultural power, were aghast. Creators, publishers, and artist advocacy groups rose up in a massive wave of protest. They argued that this was a catastrophic misinterpretation of the 2018 law. They pointed to another crucial clause in the article, one that states the exception doesn't apply if it would unreasonably prejudice the interests of the copyright owner. And they screamed, what could possibly be more prejudicial than training a machine on an artist's entire life's work to create a commercial product that makes their skills obsolete? This ignited a fierce internal struggle. Here's the chain reaction of unintended consequences. Cause: a pre-generative AI copyright law, designed for academic data mining, is interpreted by the government as applying to modern, commercial AI training. Effect: the global tech industry begins to view Japan as a potential legal safe harbor, a data haven where they can train models without fear of the lawsuits bogging them down in the US and Europe. Consequence: this sparks a furious backlash from Japan's own powerful creative industries, creating a deep national conflict and contributing to a chaotic and dangerously inconsistent patchwork of AI regulations across the globe. The meta commentary here is that we risk seeing a classic case of laws written for one reality being disastrously applied to a new one. It's like using a 19th century law about horse-drawn carriages to regulate supersonic jets. The concept of information analysis in 2018 meant something entirely different from what it means in the age of checked. Furthermore, the idea of a data haven is just a sanitized, techno-utopian rebranding of the classic tax haven. It's a race to the bottom, where countries are tempted to gut their own citizens' creative rights in the hopes of attracting a slice of the multi-trillion-dollar AI pie. This created a global legal migraine. What was potentially a billion-dollar infringement in California could be perfectly legal in Tokyo. For an international industry operating on a borderless internet, this kind of legal fragmentation is a recipe for chaos. It encourages companies to jurisdiction shop to move their ethically questionable operations to whatever country has the weakest laws, while still selling their products into the markets with the strongest ones. The battle for the soul of Japanese copyright is still raging, a perfect microcosm of the worldwide conflict. On one side, the promise of technological supremacy and economic growth. On the other, the creators who are the bedrock of the nation's cultural identity. As this international legal mess deepened, with no clear global standard in sight, the AI companies themselves began to float a radical new idea, a way to sidestep this whole messy business of human data altogether. What if, they wondered, they could just create their own data? The solution to the problem of training on human art, they proposed, might just be to stop training on humans. Faced with a planet's worth of angry artists, a growing army of aggressive lawyers, and a chaotic patchwork of international laws, the AI industry did what it always does. When faced with a messy human problem, it tried to invent a technical solution that would allow it to bypass the humans altogether. The new magic word, whispered in research papers and investor meetings, was synthetic data. The proposition was radical, seductive, and deeply, deeply weird. The solution to the problem of training AI is on human-made art, they suggested, was to train new AI is on AI-made art. The idea, on its surface, is a stroke of genius. What is synthetic data? It's any data that's artificially generated rather than collected from the real world. In this context, it means using a powerful, existing model like Stable Diffusion or Midjourney to generate millions upon millions of new images and text descriptions. This brand new 100% artificial dataset would then be used as the clean training material for the next generation of AI models. It's a data factory that runs on algorithms, a way to bootstrap a new intelligence without ever having to touch the messy, copyrighted, human-generated internet again for the AI companies. This was the holy grail. It solved their biggest problems in one elegant stroke. First, the copyright nightmare vanishes. If the training data was made by your own AI, there's no artist to sue you, no author to compensate. You own the entire pipeline from start to finish. It's a legally pristine, hermetically sealed ecosystem. Second, it's infinitely scalable. Need more pictures of cats in space helmets? You don't have to hope someone on the internet drew one. You just command your AI to generate 1 million of them, all perfectly labeled and ready for training. It's a dream of perfect, frictionless, and, most importantly, *free data. But this dream of a perfect, self-sustaining AI ecosystem has a dark, dystopian flaw, a fatal catch that researchers have given a terrifyingly evocative name: model collapse. Some even call it Habsburg AI, a reference to the European royal family that famously destroyed its genetic line through generations of inbreeding. And that's exactly what this is: digital inbreeding. When an AI is trained primarily on the output of another AI, it begins a slow, degenerative process. It's not learning from reality anymore. It's learning from a flawed, synthetic copy of reality. Imagine making a photocopy of a beautiful photograph. It looks pretty good now. Make a photocopy of that photocopy. It's a little fuzzier. The colors are a bit off now. Photocopy the photocopy of the photocopy. Repeat this 1,000 times. Eventually, you're not left with a photograph. You're left with a blurry, unrecognizable smudge. Model collapse is the algorithmic version of this. The first generation AI, trained on human data, captures a huge amount of reality's richness and diversity. The second generation AI, trained on the first output, learns a slightly more averaged, more stereotypical version of that reality. It amplifies the biases and quirks of its parent. The third generation learns an even more distorted version. Over time, the models forget the weird, unpredictable outliers of the real world and converge on a bland, homogeneous, and ultimately incorrect average. The snake begins to eat its own tail. Let's trace this strange, self-destructive loop. Cause: the immense legal, financial, and ethical burdens of using human-created data push AI labs to find an alternative. Effect: they pivot towards using synthetic, AI-generated data as the primary fuel for training new models, believing it to be a clean and infinite resource. Consequence: this introduces the profound long-term risk of model collapse, a degenerative feedback loop, where each successive generation of AI becomes a less accurate, less diverse, and more distorted reflection of the one that came before it, potentially polluting the future internet with an ocean of low-quality inbred sludge. The meta-commentary here is that this is the ultimate expression of Silicon Valley hubris. It is the dream of creating a perfect, orderly, predictable world by cutting out the messy, unpredictable human element. It's the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a serpent consuming itself, reborn as a high-tech development strategy. The belief is that you can seal your creation in a purely digital room, have it talk only to itself, and expect it to grow into a healthy, robust intelligence. But as any biologist could tell you, a closed system without new input eventually stagnates and dies. This wasn't just a theoretical fear. Researchers ran the experiments and watched it happen. They saw their models, fed on a diet of their own output, begin to lose their grip on reality, producing increasingly strange and deformed results. This pivot to synthetic data was another attempt to dodge the fundamental ethical question. Instead of building a sustainable, consensual relationship with human creators, the plan was to simply make them obsolete, to build a new world that no longer needed their input. But even as the AI labs were contemplating this strange, self-referential future, their entire industry remained utterly dependent on a very finite, very expensive resource in the real, physical world. The software was eating itself, but the hardware was in desperately short supply. While the AI labs were busy contemplating a strange future of digital inbreeding and self-referential algorithms, their present-day operations were slammed headfirst into a wall of brutal, physical reality. For all the talk of cloud computing and ethereal neural networks, the AI revolution runs on very real, very tangible hardware. Specifically, it runs on a global supply of hyper-specialized computer chips called GPUs, or graphics processing units, and the AI gold rush had triggered a global, panic-inducing, silicon-level famine. These aren't the graphics cards you use to play video games. These are computational monsters, chips like NVIDIA DIASA100 and H100, designed specifically for the kind of parallel processing that training a massive AI model requires. They are the engines of modern AI, and in 2023, they became the most sought-after, fought-over commodity in the tech world. The demand was so instantaneous and so overwhelming that it created a crippling global shortage. Companies were begging, borrowing, and spending fortunes to get their hands on these chips. A single H100 GPU could cost upwards of $40,000, and the big AI labs needed to chain together tens of thousands of them to stay competitive. This frenzy turned the chipmaker NVIDIA into one of the most valuable companies on the planet, its market cap soaring past $1 trillion. They weren't building the AI, but they were selling the shovels and pickaxes to every single prospector in the gold rush. And this created the single most glaring, most profound, and most revealing hypocrisy in this entire story. It's the paradox that lays bare the warped soul of the modern tech economy. Let's look at the balance sheet for building a revolutionary AI model. On one side, you have your most fundamental, most critical input, the data, the billions of images, the trillions of words, the sum total of human creativity that teaches the machine what the world looks like. The cost of acquiring this asset, $0. It was taken for free under the flimsy pretext that it was public. On the other side, you have the hardware, the silicon, the thousands of GPUs needed to process that free data. The cost of this asset, billions upon billions of dollars. This is the economic model of generative AI in a nutshell: infinite, unaccountable spending on computational power and a stubborn, philosophical refusal to pay a single penny for the human knowledge that makes the computation meaningful. Cause the race to build ever larger and more powerful AI models creates an insatiable, exponential demand for the specialized hardware needed to train them. Effect: a global GPU shortage makes these chips astronomically expensive and turns the manufacturer, NVIDIA, into a kingmaker, effectively controlling the pace of AI development. Consequence: this results in a fundamentally broken economic equation. A multi-trillion-dollar industry is built, spending fortunes on machinery, while assigning a literal value of zero to the human-made content that is the machine's only reason for existing. The meta commentary here is that this isn't just an economic quirk, it's a worldview. It is the ultimate expression of Silicon Valley's value system. This system posits that the only thing of true value is the asterisk process asterisk, the asterisk computation asterisk, the asterisk algorithm asterisk. The human-created input, the art, the literature, the journalism is treated not as intellectual property, but as a raw, natural resource, like iron ore or sunlight. Something to be mined and exploited, not partnered with and compensated. It is the logic of a world that would spend $1 billion to build the world's most advanced oven and then argue that it has the right to steal all the flour and eggs from the local farmers for free. This hardware bottleneck also had a chilling effect on the supposed democratization of AI. The immense cost of building a state-of-the-art server farm meant that only a handful of players, the tech Goliaths like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, and the venture capital-drenched startups like OpenAI could afford to compete. The dream of a decentralized AI future was being crushed by the sheer, brute force economics of silicon. Power was being concentrated in the hands of the few who could afford the computational rent. And every single dollar in that multi-trillion-dollar hardware boom, every cent of NVIDIA's soaring stock price, was predicated on the original sin. The entire, insanely expensive enterprise was built on the foundation of free, unconsented, human-generated data. The fortunes being made in the hardware market were a direct downstream consequence of the decision to not pay the creators. It was time for the conversation to move past the lawsuits, the stock prices, and the technical debates. It was time to talk about the actual people at the bottom of this pyramid, the human cost. We've waded through the murky depths of copyright law, the abstract peaks of latent space, and the dizzying, hypocritical world of venture capital. But beneath all of it, beneath the lawsuits and the billion-dollar valuations, are the actual human beings this story is about. The illustrators, the writers, the photographers, the musicians, the people who don't have a multi-trillion-dollar market cap, just a mortgage, a passion, and a skill they've spent a lifetime honing. The so-called disruption of the AI revolution wasn't just a line on a stock chart. It was a direct, personal, and often brutal assault on their livelihoods and their sense of self. This is the human cost. For working creators, the arrival of generative AI wasn't a magical new tool, it was the sound of a tidal wave approaching the shore. The first impact was economic, and it was immediate. Job postings in creative fields began to change. Suddenly, proficiency in Midjourney was listed as a required skill, often in place of traditional ones like drawing or photography. Companies that once hired freelance illustrators for blog post headers or marketing materials could now generate a dozen options in 5 minutes for the cost of a monthly subscription. The market for entry-level creative work, the kind of gigs that young artists rely on to start their careers, began to evaporate. Rates plummeted as human artists found themselves suddenly competing against a machine that was infinitely fast, infinitely cheap, and had been secretly trained on their own portfolios. But the financial pain, as real as it was almost secondary to a deeper, more insidious kind of harm: the systematic devaluation of human skill. Imagine being a concept artist who has spent 20 years learning anatomy, composition, lighting, and color theory. You've sacrificed nights and weekends, invested tens of thousands of dollars in education and equipment, and dedicated your entire being to mastering a craft. And then you watch as a manager who can draw a stick figure type's epic fantasy castle in the style of your name, and gets a result in 45 seconds that is 90% as good as what you could produce in 2 days. The machine doesn't just replicate your output, it trivializes your input. It renders your decades of struggle, practice, and passion into a quaint, inefficient hobby. The very act of creation, the human process of trial and error, of discovery and insight, is reframed as a slow, obsolete data generation method. This was the profound existential dread that settled over the creative community. It wasn't just the fear of losing a job, it was the fear of losing your purpose, of having your entire identity and life's work declared irrelevant by an algorithm. This brings us to the human-level cause and effect, the one that doesn't show up in a legal filing. Cause: the market is flooded with a near-infinite supply of high-quality, instantly generated, and ethically unburdened synthetic media, available for pennies. Effect: the perceived value of human-generated creative work plummets. Companies begin to replace human creators with AI for a growing number of tasks, and the skills that once defined a creative professional are devalued. Consequence: millions of creators face a dual crisis, a direct threat to their economic survival, and a profound psychological toll as their identity, skill, and sense of worth are systematically undermined by a technology they unwittingly helped build. The meta commentary here is that we need to be honest about the language we use. Silicon Valley loves the word disruption. It's a clean, exciting, forward-looking term. But on the ground, for the people being disrupted, it's a euphemism for having your career, your community, and your sense of purpose dismantled. The human cost of this revolution isn't a bug. It's a core feature of the move fast and break things ideology. It is the vast, unquantified externality that never appears on a venture capitalist spreadsheet. The pain and dislocation of millions of people is simply the cost of doing business, the necessary friction of progress. This is why the fight became so personal, so ferocious. The artists weren't just fighting for a legal principle, they were fighting for their survival. They were fighting for their dignity. They were fighting for the very idea that a human being's dedicated, lifelong effort is worth more than a statistical model derived from it. The exhaustion was palpable. Instead of spending their days creating, artists were now forced to spend them as part-time activists, amateur lawyers, and digital saboteurs, poisoning their own data just to stay afloat. It was a war of attrition, and it was taking a heavy toll. With the stakes this high, with everything on the line, everyone looked to the courts, hoping for a clear answer, a decisive victory that would finally settle the matter. They would be sorely disappointed. With the battle lines drawn, the evidence gathered, and the human cost becoming painfully clear, all eyes turned to the courts. The artists, the authors, the tech giants, and the investors all held their breath, waiting for the first real signal from the one group of people who could actually decide the outcome: the judges. The AI companies filed motions to dismiss the lawsuits, hoping the courts would swat them away like a nuisance, declaring the artists' claims baseless and ending the war before it even truly began. What they got instead was a masterclass in judicial fence-sitting. The first rulings came down, and they were a deeply unsatisfying, profoundly anticlimactic, and perfectly calculated mess. The main event was the artists' class action lawsuit, Anderson v. Stability AI et al. In late 2023. The presiding judge, William Orrick of the Northern District of California, issued his ruling on the defendants' motions to dismiss. Both sides leaned in, hoping for a knockout blow. Neither got it. The ruling was a classic split decision, a judicial shrug that guaranteed this fight would become a long, grinding war of attrition. First, the bad news for the artists. The judge dismissed most of the claims against Midjourney and DeviantArt. The reasoning was simple. The plaintiff's case was built heavily on the public, searchable Lion dataset, which was directly tied to Stability AI. But they hadn't provided enough specific, concrete evidence that Midjourney's and DeviantArt's closed proprietary models had also trained on their specific work. The judge essentially said, "Your accusation is plausible, but you haven't shown me the receipts for these to defendants yet." He also trimmed away many of the secondary legal claims, like vicarious infringement, calling them underdeveloped. The artist's sprawling, multi-front assault was narrowed to a single focus point. But then came the good news, and it was a lifeline. Judge Oreck allowed the single most important claim to move forward, the core charge of direct copyright infringement against Stability AI. He ruled that the artist had more than plausibly alleged that Stability AI had scraped and copied their work as part of the Lion dataset to train Stable Diffusion. This was the victory the artist desperately needed. It meant the case was not being thrown out. The central pillar of their argument that scraping their art to train a commercial AI is illegal had survived the first test. The lawsuit was alive, and what about the multi-trillion-dollar question? The one upon which the entire future of the industry rested, the question of fair use. The judge took one look at that philosophical and legal supernova and punted hard. He explicitly stated that the fair use defense was too complex, in fact, intensive to be decided at this early stage. He was not going to make a snap judgment that could either legitimize or obliterate an entire industry. That question, he signaled, would have to wait for the main event, the long, expensive processes of discovery, expert testimony, and a full trial. Let's follow the legal maneuvering. Cause, the AI companies, hoping to end the rebellion quickly, asked the court to dismiss all the lawsuits against them on principle. Effect, the judge issues a series of mixed rulings, cutting the weaker parts of the artists and authors' cases, but allowing the central, foundational claim of direct copyright infringement to proceed against the main defendants. Consequence, this results in a legal stalemate. There is no quick victory for anyone. Both sides can spin the rulings as a win, which guarantees that the conflict will now descend into years of costly, brutal, and deeply uncertain litigation. The meta commentary is that this is the legal system working exactly as designed, slowly, cautiously, and with an extreme reluctance to make groundbreaking decisions until absolutely necessary. The judge's ruling was the legal equivalent of saying, "This is an unholy mess of unprecedented scale and complexity, and I am not fixing it today." It was a signal that the courts were just as overwhelmed by the implications of this technology as everyone else. They recognized the legitimacy of the creator's grievance, but they were also terrified of the economic consequences of a sweeping, industry-killing ruling. So the war was destined to drag on. Similar rulings followed in the authors' cases against OpenAI and Meta, trimming the edges but keeping the core infringement claims alive. For the AI companies, this was a win of a sort. They had avoided the apocalypse. Their billion-dollar war chest meant they could easily afford to pay lawyers for the next decade. For the artists and authors, it was a more bitter victory. They had survived, but they were now locked in a legal purgatory, a war of financial attrition against some of the richest companies in human history, with no clear legal resolution on the horizon. The conversation began to shift one last time. If the law couldn't provide an answer, perhaps philosophy could. The question was becoming less about what was legal and more about what was right. And so, we arrive at the present-day stalemate, a state of glorious, super-saturated, high-stakes confusion. The lawsuits are inching their way through the legal system at the speed of a dying glacier. The technology, meanwhile, is accelerating at the speed of light, with new, more powerful models being announced every 6 months. The market has fractured into a messy collection of ethical walled gardens, legally dubious powerhouses, and open-source wild cards. The politicians are still holding hearings. The artists are still fighting. Nothing is resolved, and in the vacuum left by the absence of any clear legal or ethical consensus, the entire conflict has metastasized. It has evolved from a messy argument about copyright into a full-blown existential crisis. For the human race, the fight is no longer just about permission, it's about purpose. The arrival of generative AI has forced us, kicking and screaming, to confront a series of deeply uncomfortable questions about ourselves. Questions we were happily ignoring before the magic art robot showed up. After all the legal briefs have been filed and all the technical defenses have been made, we are left staring into a strange new mirror, asking, What the hell is art, anyway? First, there's the question of skill. For all of human history, we have valued the skill of the artist, the years of practice, the steady hand, the deep knowledge of craft. But what is the value of that human process if a machine can replicate the end result in seconds? Does the struggle matter? Does the intention matter? Or is the only thing of value the final, aesthetically pleasing arrangement of pixels? We are being forced to decide whether we value the painter or just the painting. The tech industry has placed its bet. The process is irrelevant, only the product matters. The rest of us are not so sure. This leads to the question of purpose. Is the point of art simply to create beautiful or interesting things to look at? If so, the machines are already winning, and their victory is inevitable. But if art is something more, if it's about communication, about one human soul reaching out to another through a shared experience, about expressing a unique point of view shaped by a life lived, then the machine can't compete, or can it? The AI, trained on the entirety of our shared culture, can create images that evoke deep emotion. But is it expressing an emotion? Or is it just creating a statistically perfect facsimile of what an emotional image is supposed to look like? We are now locked in a global Turing test for the human heart. Then there is the future of the human creator in this new world. What does it mean to be an artist? Are they destined to become prompt engineers, whisperers to the machine, curators of an AI's output? Is the future of creativity not a paintbrush, but a well-phrased command line? Or will the opposite happen? Will human made become the ultimate marker of luxury and authenticity? A niche, artisanal category for the wealthy, like hand-stitched leather in an age of mass-produced vinyl? Let's trace the final, philosophical chain reaction. Cause, the legal, political, and market systems all fail to produce a clean, simple, or timely resolution to the conflict over generative AI and copyright. Effect, with no practical answers available, the conversation is forced to elevate, shifting from a tangible dispute over property to an intangible and deeply unsettling crisis over the meaning and value of human creativity itself. Consequence, we are left in a state of permanent, unresolved ambiguity. The technology is here to stay, but the fundamental questions it raises about our culture, our economy, our values, and our own role in a world with non-human creators remain terrifyingly unanswered. The meta commentary is this. This is the real, lasting legacy of the AI gold rush. The lawsuits will, one day, be settled or decided. Laws will, eventually, be written. But the existential Pandora's box that has been opened cannot be closed. In their frantic, arrogant, and legally dubious race to build a new kind of intelligence, the tech companies accidentally forced humanity into a global, philosophical emergency meeting with itself. They wanted to build a product, but they ended up triggering a referendum on the human soul. The initial question was who gave permission, but the final, lingering question, the one that will haunt us for the rest of our lives, is a much simpler and much more terrifying one. Are we obsolete? And so, the world is left with a half-built technological utopia resting on a foundation of legal chaos and profound human anxiety, which is probably the most stable outcome we could have hoped for. Look, this whole saga is a glorious, complex, and ongoing dumpster fire of ethics, law, and venture capital. So please, for the love of all that is holy, do not take this as financial, legal, or even moral advice. This was just a slightly insane attempt to make sense of the mess, and it was hopefully way more entertaining than reading a 50-page legal complaint. If there's another modern phenomenon, another corporate showdown, another bizarre internet trend, another thing that makes you scream, how is this legal, that you think needs the simplified and sarcastic treatment, drop it in the comments below. And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't trust the algorithm.